All right. Good morning, everyone. We are so sorry for those technical difficulties, but we believe that we are up and running again. So, welcome, LAUSD. We are so happy to be joining you. My name is Sarah. I work in the education department here at the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach. And today we are going to be talking all about corals. Now, corals are a really interesting animal and create beautiful, diverse, and unique habitat. And we're going to start off by talking about what a coral is and some of the animals that live there. And then I'm going to give you all a couple minutes to share your observations with your group, share with your teacher, ask some questions, and then we'll come back together and we'll talk about some of the threats or challenges that corals are facing today in our oceans. And then I'll give you another couple minutes to ask some more questions, share some more thoughts, and then we'll end our program by talking about things that we are doing, that other organizations are doing, and that you can do to help protect corals and other animals in the ocean. So that's kind of how this program is going to go today. Now, I'm not alone in the studio. I have Cynthia, who's going to be controlling all the things that you see behind me, and Dana is on the computer taking your questions. So to start, we're going to make some observations of a coral reef habitat. So I'm going to have Cynthia put a change the screen behind us, and she's going to put on one of our webcams. So a lot of our exhibits here, we have cameras in them, and we can take a look at what is happening in those exhibits. So I'm going to step off the screen. And this exhibit here is Blue Corner. This is our tropical coral reef. It's our largest exhibit here at the aquarium. And it is a good example of what a coral reef looks like. It's actually modeled off of a real dive site off the coast of Palau. And when we say tropical, that means the water is really warm. It's in the mid to high 70s. Now I want you to take a look and make some observations. What do you see? What shapes do you see? Maybe what colors? Do you see any animals? How are those animals moving? Are they interacting with each other? What about what's behind the animals? Because it's not just animals in here. Look at that habitat. What do you notice about that habitat? So there's a lot of things that we can explore and observe in this exhibit. But what I want to focus on is the coral. So all these structures that you see here behind all those fish and sharks swimming around, those are coral structures. Now, in this exhibit, the coral is what we call artificial. It's not live coral, and that's because this is a massive exhibit, and we didn't want to take that much coral from the ocean to put into this exhibit. But thinking about coral, live coral, what is coral? Is it an animal? Is it a plant? Is it a rock? Because sometimes it kind of looks hard like a rock. So what exactly is coral? Now, if you thought or you shared that you think coral is an animal, you are correct. But it's a really unique animal because it's what we call a colonial animal. So it's a bunch of little animals that all group together. Now, coral is related to animals like anemones and sea jellies. And so corals have these really little polyps in them, and they share this relationship with an algae. And the algae is called zooxanthellae. Now, what this algae does is as algae gets energy from the sun, they process that sun for energy, and they share that energy with that little coral polyp, and it helps them build that structure, that hard structure that you see on a lot of these corals. And so they build these calcium carbonate structures, and they keep building and building and building until they build these big coral structures. I have a document camera, and we're going to move over to this document camera and take a closer look at some corals. So on this screen here, I have a couple different corals, and corals come in different shapes, different sizes. Now, these corals are not alive anymore, which is why they are white. But if you look closely at these different corals, I'm going to see if we can zoom in a little. Give it a minute. So these corals, they have all these little structures in them. I'm going to come on over to the screen, and I'm going to point out right over here. If you take a look at these little individual circles, they each belong to one coral polyp. And each polyp has that little algae in it and helps it grow that hard calcium structure. Now, that algae also provides the coral with all the bright colors. So maybe we'll take a look at another picture of some corals here at the aquarium, and we can take a look at all those bright colors. Excellent. So here is another picture of a coral reef, and you can notice all those bright colors in there. And corals come in all shapes and sizes. Some are really long, some can be kind of round, some have branches. They have all different shapes. Oh, this one's cool. This is called a brain coral. Can you guess why? Kind of looks like a brain, all those little lines in there. So some are really round, some can be kind of branches, some have, there's even soft coral, so not all corals are hard. So they come in all different shapes and sizes. Now, coral reefs, they only make up about 1% of our ocean's habitat. which if you think about it is only a really tiny amount of our ocean's habitat. But they contain at least 25% of our ocean species. So this tiny area has massive biodiversity, has a ton of animals. And in this picture, we can see some of those animals that live in the coral reef right here. You might recognize this fish. Does anyone recognize it? This is our blue pallet tang, and they make their home in coral reefs. We have some other fish in here as well. And the coral reef not only provides home to animals, provides shelter, but it also provides food for some animals. So maybe we'll bring up a picture of an animal who might snack on some coral. Excellent. This is one of my favorite fish we have here at the aquarium, partly because they always look like they're smiling, but their mouth is actually a bunch of little tiny teeth that have been fused together into a beak. I'll step over here so you can see their mouth. So it has been fused into a beak, and what they do is they munch on coral. Now, what they really want is that algae inside. That is the nutritious part for them. But they're going to munch on that coral using that beak to break into it, and then they poop out the coral, which is what gives us all our white sandy beaches in tropical areas. So if you've ever been somewhere where there's that white sandy beach in a tropical area, you're actually walking on parrotfish poop. But our parrotfish are really important for our coral reefs because they do eat that coral, and it actually helps make room for other corals to grow. So our parrotfish might snack on some of the corals that aren't doing so well, and that way they can eat all that coral away, and that leaves room in the reef for more corals to grow. Now, another animal that is really important to our coral reefs, if we go back to our tropical camera, because this area, when we look at our trop camera, is modeled, as I said, after a real dive site, and this area in Palau is one of the first shark sanctuaries. So we have some shark species right up here. Is one of our bonnet heads. It's a type of hammerhead, and they make their home in the coral reefs, and they use this coral reef as a place to find food and for shelter. And so coral reefs are really important for a range of species, for lots of fish, for sharks, and also even some sea turtles. And we have one turtle in this area, and we have two other turtles here at our aquarium and other tropical exhibits we have at the aquarium. So coral reefs are a really important resource, a really important habitat in our ocean, partly because of their biodiversity. It also is important because it brings a lot of tourism to areas. So a lot of people will travel to these tropical areas. Hello, fish. They'll travel to these tropical areas to go snorkeling or diving or just to be near them. And that tourism is really important in helping these communities that live along the coast with the coral reefs. All right, so this is going to be our first pause. So I'm going to leave this camera up and I'm going to step off, and I want you guys to share your observations you've made. If you have any questions about coral reefs, share those questions and send them in to us, and we'll answer your questions. And when we come back, we'll start talking about how or what threats or what challenges coral reefs are facing. So even think about that. What are some things you think might be causing challenges for coral reefs to be growing and surviving and thriving? So go ahead. I'm going to step off and make those observations and share those questions. All right, so we have a lot of great questions coming in. So I'm going to address some of these questions. So Joey wants to know, why do we have coral reefs? And that's a great question. They are one of our habitats in our ocean. And they're also pretty. So they're really cool for us to enjoy, but they're really important because it provides so many homes to a lot of animals. Now, Valerie wants to know, how can I help protect coral reefs? And Amber and Sophia also asked, how do we affect the coral reefs? And we are going to talk about how we affect them now. And then the last section, we will cover what we can do to protect them. So those are excellent questions. And I haven't forgotten them. We will get to them. And then Nathan wanted to know, what is coral? So we mentioned that coral is an animal, and it has that algae that grows inside of it that helps it build its calcium carbonate structure. Now, something I didn't mention before is that coral needs water to be a certain temperature. It's a pretty vulnerable or fragile animal. And so if the water temperature fluctuates even 2 or 3 degrees, most animals, they can adapt. They can adjust to that change in water temperature. But coral, it can't really adjust. It stresses out that algae if the water temperature increases even 2 or 3 degrees. And if that algae gets stressed, they're going to leave that calcium carbonate structure, and they're going to find a better home, another home where the water is more their kind of speed, where it's more comfortable for them. And that's what we call coral bleaching. So that's when the coral in the ocean, so not like the coral I showed you on the camera, but coral in the ocean loses its color because that algae has gone to find a more comfortable place to live. Now, when a coral bleaches, it doesn't mean that coral is dead necessarily, but it is very hard for coral to come back from that. Now, I also didn't mention that coral needs really clean and clear water, and that's because that algae, that zooxanthellae, it uses the sun to produce energy, and in order to get that sunlight, it needs the water to be nice and clean and clear. So if there's anything that kind of fogs up that water, it makes it harder for it to get that sunlight. And that brings us to some of the challenges that are facing coral reefs today. So if you think about, we are constantly burning something called fossil fuels. When we drive our cars, with all the factories and manufacturing of everything we use in our daily lives, we are burning these fossil fuels. And when fossil fuels are burned, it releases CO2, which is carbon dioxide. Now, there is some normal level of carbon dioxide that is released, but with all the excess of cars and manufacturing, and when there's more than normal amounts of fossil fuels being burned, so there's more than normal carbon dioxide in the air, it creates what we call a heat trapping blanket. So think about, if you're really cold at home one day and you're trying to warm up, you might put a blanket on you. But you know, that blanket might be kind of thin, so you might put another blanket on top of you. And if you're like me and you collect blankets and you just have them all over your house, you might put a third blanket on you. And now you're nice and snugly warm because you've trapped all that heat around you with those blankets. But say you're sitting there for a while and then you start to get really hot. What can you do? You take off those blankets, right? You remove one, and then maybe you remove another, and then you might remove that third blanket, and then we can cool off. But on our planet, when we release all this CO2 and it creates this blanket around the Earth, we can't take off that blanket so easily. And so it traps all that heat in the atmosphere. And because it's in the atmosphere, it also transfers into the ocean. And what that means is that our ocean temperature is rising. Now, I had just mentioned that coral is a pretty fragile animal. And if our ocean temperatures rise even 2 or 3 degrees, it causes that coral extra stress that algae might leave, and it's really hard for that coral to recover. So with all these excess fossil fuels we're burning, our ocean's temperatures are rising, and it's stressing out our corals. And if our corals aren't alive, think about animals like that parrotfish, that its food source is the coral. And if the coral isn't alive with that algae in it, then that parrotfish doesn't have anything to eat. And if all the corals start to slowly die off, all those animals who relied on coral, it makes it really hard for them to survive. Now, another way, or another challenge with all that excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is it changes the water chemistry. So our ocean, yes, it's salt water, but there's a really complex chemistry in that water. And it's different depending on where you look in the ocean, but that chemistry helps those animals in that environment. And with the excess carbon dioxide, it changes the acidity level of our ocean. And what that really means is it just affects all those building blocks that coral needs to build its structure. It doesn't have those right blocks. So think about if you're building something with blocks and trying to build a tower and you have different shapes and they may not all fit together, it's really hard to build something. And so if coral doesn't have all the right building blocks it needs to build its structure, it's going to make it really hard for it to build the way it should to help support coral reefs and all those animals. So those are some really big issues that are facing our coral reefs, and they all have to do with how our water temperature is rising and how the water chemistry is changing. Now we have a couple more questions we're going to get to. So Sebastian wants to know, how did fish learn coral was food? Ooh, that is a good question. I don't really know exactly the origin, but I would imagine that these fish who are living in this area, they might be looking for something to eat. And not all corals are hard. Some of them can actually be really soft, and they might move similar to a way another animal they might eat might look. And so they might think, oh, maybe that is that animal that I was looking to eat, and they bite it, and they realize it's not that animal, but it tasted good. So here's a good picture of some of our corals that are moving. I'm going to move over here because this coral right here is kind of swaying. So it might look similar to other animals that that fish might be eating. And so they might eat it and find that it's not that main food source, but it does provide them with some food. So that's a great question, Sebastian. Now, Sophia wants to know, are corals in danger? And good question, Sophia. I'm sorry I didn't see that before talking, but yes, corals are in danger because of our changes in our ocean. Now, Natalie wants to know, how big can coral reefs grow? Well, that's a great question. We have coral reefs around the world in different oceans. The Great Barrier Reef is the largest coral reef. It's 133,000 miles. That's a really big area. It covers a huge amount of land, or amount of ocean. So the coral reefs can be really big. They continue to grow, but they are facing all these challenges, which puts a threat on them continuing to grow and prosper the way they once were. Now, Nathan wants to know, how old can coral be? Ooh, that is a great question. So it depends on the type of coral, but corals can live for thousands of years. But it really depends on where that coral is growing, sort of what is happening around it. If there's tropical storms happening and big waves that are crashing on the reef, it might break the reefs or damage them. And we've talked about all these challenges, so that is going to put a threat on these corals living for a really long time. But in perfect conditions, they can live about 1,000 years or more. Now, Ronnie wants to know, why don't our animals eat each other? That's a great question. So if you look in here, we've got a bunch of different fish. Even if we go back to our big tropical exhibit, and you'll notice there's a lot of fish swimming around. There's also a lot of sharks in there, and they don't eat each other. Now, there's a couple different reasons why these animals are not eating. Now, one, we feed our animals a lot. We feed them a couple times a day to make sure that they're not hungry, and they're not searching for food. But also, these animals naturally, out in the wild, in their natural habitat, they're going to live together in harmony. So we create our exhibits to look like they would out in the wild, and we put animals who would naturally live together in the same exhibit and animals who wouldn't interact in a negative way with each other. So these animals naturally live together in harmony, kind of minding their own business. They all use the coral for the same reason, and they all kind of swim around and do their own thing, and they have different food sources, and like I said, they're not really looking to eat each other. All right, I think I've got all of our questions so far, but we are about at time to pause again to send in more questions. But I want you to think, because the next section we're going to answer what some people have asked already, is how can we help coral reefs? So we know some of the challenges that are facing our coral reefs, but what can you do to help protect our ocean? Now, we here in California, we don't live along the coral reefs. So that is a really far destination. But do we still have an effect on coral reefs? We can. So think about ways that, even if we're not near a coral reef, how can we protect them? Or even just these things, that the way that we can protect the coral reef also protect our local oceans. So think about some ways that we can protect our oceans, and we're going to come back and talk about some of those solutions. All right, welcome back. So we have a couple questions we're going to get to before we start talking about ways that we can help protect coral reefs and the ocean. So Ivan wants to know, how many coral reefs are there? We don't know the exact number, there are a lot, but like I said, they do cover about 1% of ocean's habitats. And the biggest one is that the coral reef in Australia, the Great Barrier Reef. Now, Nathan wants to know, are you talking about greenhouse gas effect? So when I mentioned the heat trapping blanket, that's basically the same thing as the greenhouse gas effect. So think about a greenhouse when you build it to grow vegetables or fruits or plants, and how it traps in all that heat and all that stuff for those plants in a small contained space. It's basically the same idea. When we are releasing all this CO2, it gets trapped in our atmosphere. It has nowhere else to go, and so it hangs in the atmosphere, warming our air, and then that also moves into the ocean, warming the ocean. And Natalie wants to know, how do corals move? Well, that is a great question. So some corals, like the hard corals, they're not going to move very much. They're going to continue to grow. They build those calcium structures, but they're not going to move. And then there's soft corals who might move in the ocean, but they're pretty much staying in one place. And that's because they're creating this reef. So they're basically attached to a structure, and then they build their structure on top of each other, and the reef is there set. Now, reefs are really important, especially for a lot of island or coastal communities, because it creates sort of like a break wall. So if there's big waves crashing or storms, a coral reef can actually protect that coastline from big waves crashing onto that community, and it just stays in the ocean. All right, so we want to talk about how we can protect coral reefs, or what work is being done. Now, our aquarium here, Aquarium of the Pacific, we are working with other organizations on propagating or growing corals. So we have a couple different projects in play, and here is coral propagation. So coral does what we call broadcast spawning, where it sends the sperm and the eggs up and they meet in the middle, and we are collecting corals when they spawn out in their wild or native or natural habitats, and we are helping collect information and data on these growing corals. So that's one way that we are helping coral reefs, is doing research and studying and going out and studying these reefs in their natural habitat, and then bringing stuff back here, and we can help grow corals. Now, we also propagate corals here when we get corals at the aquarium, and if pieces break off, you can actually continue to grow those branches once they break off. And so we are working on propagating or regrowing those branches if they break off. And then we have a team who go out and replant those corals out in the wild. Now, thinking about things that you can do. What can you do on a personal level with your family at home, or with your school group, or in your community? What things can you do to protect coral reefs, or even the ocean? So let's think about some of those challenges. We talked about burning all these excess fossil fuels and all that carbon dioxide, or we even talked about how if the water is kind of cloudy, right? If water's not really clear, it's harder for that coral to get sun, or to get energy from the sun. So what things could cause that cloudiness? What in the ocean could cause cloudiness that maybe doesn't belong there? If you're thinking trash or pollution, you're absolutely right. And so pollution, runoff from pesticides in plants, or any kind of trash that we just discard and we don't get rid of properly, makes its way to the ocean, and that can affect the clarity of the water, which can then affect the ability for corals and other animals who use the sun for energy to get that energy. So basic things we can think about doing is maybe doing a beach cleanup or a community cleanup, going around your community and picking up trash, or just making sure that when you have trash, it goes into the trash can, or it goes into the recycling, whatever the proper bin is. And also thinking about plastics. Plastic we talk about a lot because it ends up in the ocean and it breaks down, but it never disappears. So that means there's tiny plastic particles in the ocean, and that a lot of animals end up eating, or it can create that kind of cloudiness if there's a lot of plastic particles in the ocean. So maybe thinking about using reusable items instead of one-use plastics. Thinking about water bottles, reusing your water bottle or getting a reusable water bottle, or straws, getting a glass or a reusable straw instead of using those plastic ones. So these are all little things that you can do in your community to help protect our corals and our oceans. Now, another thing for coral is what research has shown recently is sunscreen can affect those corals, and that adds that cloudiness. So you might see, if you're going to buy sunscreen, even here in California where we don't have coral reefs, Reef Safe sunscreen. And that means that that sunscreen doesn't have those chemicals that when you put it on your body and you get into the water, might rub off and affect those corals or other animals. Now, another thing you can think about doing is we talk about carbon dioxide. So we talk about reducing our carbon footprint. So everyone has a carbon footprint. No matter what you do in your daily life, you have a carbon footprint, because things you do in your daily life, even without thinking about it, turning on light switches, using any appliances, that all gives off carbon dioxide. It burns those fossil fuels. And so we can think about ways that we can reduce our carbon footprint. Like maybe you don't need all the lights on in your house at one time. You can remember to turn your light off from your room if you're going out into the kitchen or you're going somewhere else, making sure you turn off that light. Or if you're using something that plugs into the wall when you're using it, instead of just turning it off, you unplug it. And that can reduce your carbon footprint. Or thinking about in your community, if you can walk somewhere or bike somewhere instead of driving, that can reduce your carbon footprint. Or even carpooling when you're going somewhere. If you're all going to the same place, you can carpool, and that's one less car or two less cars that are being used, and that can also reduce your carbon footprint. Now, it's a big task to protect our corals and our ocean, but all these little things that you can do in your community, they all help protect the ocean because it's a bunch of us doing little things together. And when we put that all together, it becomes a big movement of protecting our oceans. So think about ways that when you go home today, or when you're in your community, or when you're discussing things with your group, what are ways that you can commit to helping protect our ocean? So I'm going to leave that as your takeaway, things that you can do in your daily life to help protect our ocean. I hope you enjoyed this session with us, and I believe we might be seeing you again next week or the week after, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.